Okay, thank you. So if Colonel Parker had the challenge of following lunch, I guess I have the challenge of following Colonel Parker. My slides might look unintelligible to most of you because there's far fewer acronyms. There's going to be a lot more reading on these slides than what we've been used to so far. I think MPH, which is the degree that follows my name, is the only acronym that you'll find throughout these slides. First, I just want to say thank you to Army-Baylor for coordinating this and for inviting us here. I think when Lorena reached out and asked if UCLA would be willing to speak and present, there was about a half-a-second pause before we said yes, absolutely. We've been fortunate at UCLA Health to have the Army-Baylor Fellows, which is a word I use. I know we use residents here, and we've been using that word. We've been fortunate to have them coming through our organization for the better part of the last decade or so, with some breaks in the chain, but every single time that we've gotten a fellow, we've had a really rewarding experience. So I was asked to speak for a couple minutes on a background to UCLA Health. What is the structure of our civilian fellowship that we have at UCLA Health? What are some of the practices that we consider best practices or things that work really well? And if there are any immediate past projects that our fellows have worked on, can we overview those? So to begin, my name's Drew Weil, and as mentioned, I work at UCLA Health. I've been there for a little over 3 years now. I'm the manager of hospital operations there, and the most common question I get after that is, well, what does that title mean? We don't have quite the same standard title process that you all have in the military, but for us, the manager of hospital operations serves as kind of a chief of staff to our chief operating officer. And I'll explain with a little bit more depth what is in his purview, our chief operating officer. But the role for me is I get to work closely with him, his name's Richard Azar, and then communicate his vision and the organization's vision for operations across all of his direct reports, which totals about 15 right now. In addition to working across that entire operations team, some of the more fun and exciting things I get to do in my role are help oversee our administrative fellowship, our residency program, where we have both civilian and Army-Baylor fellows, as well as our graduate administrative internship cohort, which is kind of a first cousin to our fellowship program, condensed down into only 10 weeks. And this year, actually just this Monday, we had a new cohort of 10 administrative interns from across the country come and implant themselves in the organization. So very exciting. And the other just interesting thing that I'll note is that I was a former fellow at UCLA Health as well, which is interesting and helpful because as I go through and help to coordinate and lead both our fellowship and our internship program, a lot of what I do comes from what I felt like were really successful and smart practices by my predecessors. Prior to coming to UCLA, I received a bachelor's degree at Central Michigan and then also at Yale, and I'm fortunate to have landed in Southern California. So a quick overview of UCLA Health in the context to where our fellows learn and the proving grounds where they find themselves in. So another what's in a name. Within the UCLA Health name, which is on all of our billboards and our buildings and any one of our clinics across Southern California, you can really think of two separate arms working together to advance our four-part missions. And so on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, you see the David Geffen School of Medicine. And while neither of these two things could function without the other arm, this David Geffen School of Medicine is the arm that's really pushing forward our research and our education parts of that four-part mission. Our right arm is the UCLA Health System. Again, these things could not operate in a vacuum, but that right arm is overseeing all the clinical operations and really the service to the community itself. And when you take a double click into those two blue dots, you can actually see all of the things that compose that a little bit further. And the one thing I will just call out here on this slide is that in addition to just that one connecting bar that connects the blue dots, there's only one other place that's connecting those two blue dots together, and those are the clinical departments. And so at UCLA Health, we have 19 clinical departments, each of them with a chair and then vice chairs and divisions within each of them. But that's kind of the conduit that's pulling together our academic and our clinical operations missions. And what these clinical departments do is they employ the faculty members and the physicians that then drive the clinical operations within all of our clinical sites. And so as a fellow, and again, I won't spend too much time on this, but just enough to give you context to where our fellows are having opportunities and where they're able to go out and get their hands dirty. We have 4 hospitals and then an entire clinic system across Southern California. So the first and kind of flagship hospital is our Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. This is located in Westwood, a little over 1 million square feet that we just moved into. And this is more or less our TQ hub, our tertiary or quaternary hub, where we do more solid organ transplants than any other hospital. We do a growing number of BMT and cellular therapies in this hospital. And this is also just about 25 yards away from where our administrative fellows and interns sit. And this is also an interesting building because within that 1.1 million square feet, if you enter through this door right here that's up on the slide, you're entering through the actual Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. But if you're just to continue down the street a little bit and take a hard left on Charles E. Young Drive and keep walking, you'd eventually find another entrance, which actually has a butterfly mural right on the inside. And if you entered through that entrance and you found yourself in the same lobby as Ronald Reagan, you'd actually enter through the UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital entrance. If you took the elevator up to the 3rd or the 5th floor, you'd find 90 beds and a top 30 ranked pediatric hospital, which has its own pediatric floor beds, a NICU, PICU, OB, nursery, and dedicated OR space as well. So then if you went back to the elevator, and you went back down to the ground level, and you continued almost now 360 degrees around the hospital, you'd find a third entrance, again entering into the same lobby of the same building, but you'd be entering through the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital at UCLA. And again, if you took the elevator up to the 4th floor this time, you'd step out into a completely separately licensed hospital within a hospital. So you guys might be able to tell, in addition to being in California, the fellows and the residents get a lot of exposure to clinical regulatory affairs, get a lot of exposure to just the nitty-gritty, what goes into a hospital. So now if we exited the hospital, and this time we got into our electric cars or our electric scooters, and we went about 4 miles down the street, we'd find ourselves at the Santa Monica UCLA Medical Center, which is, whereas Ronald Reagan is our TQ hub, this is more akin to a high acuity community hospital, where we have certain select programs completely housed over here, including orthopedics and our rape treatment center. In addition to the acute care settings where our fellows get to find projects and go out and try and improve operations, there's also a clinic network of primary and specialty clinics that go all over Southern California, as far north as San Luis Obispo, as far west as Ventura, as far east as Pasadena, and as far south as Laguna Niguel. And so if you're trying to drive to all of these clinics in a day, I just wouldn't recommend driving to all these clinics in a day. It would take hours and hours, especially in California. And I share all of this background to where our clinical operations are, because although our administrative fellowship is based out of hospital operations, with our chief operating officer serving as the ultimate preceptor and executive sponsor for it, we try to find opportunities that span the entire health system for those fellows to operate within. So our fellowship, both for civilians and Army-Baylor fellows, are 12 months in duration, and our structure is really project-based. That's at the heart of it, where we want the fellows to go out and take all the theoretical knowledge that they've just learned in 10 months or in 2 years, depending on their program, and we want them to get their hands dirty and actually go out and apply it. In addition to that, we want them to go do the rotations. We want them to go get the shadowing experiences and work with people that they wouldn't have an opportunity to shadow with otherwise. But as we're finding those projects, again, the places to get their hands dirty, we think of it in kind of a two-dimensional or an XY axis, where we want the fellow to have some autonomy in finding those projects. So looking at the bear and looking at places where their competencies are a little soft, or looking for the experiences that they just haven't been able to accrue yet in their careers, and we put that along the x-axis. And then at the same time, we're trying to match up on the y-axis, or the vertical, what does the organization really need? And what's a high-impact project to the organization? And when we can do it well, we'll find one that intersects at the far outside corner of that, where we're satisfying both the organization and what the fellow really will benefit from. Again, Richard Azar, our Chief Operating Officer, is the ultimate preceptor for the fellowship. Fellows have complete access to his calendar. We see him every single morning in our daily tiered huddles, where we meet in his office to get a pulse check on what's going on in the facilities. But then another feature of our program is that there's myself. While I work closely with Richard, I also work closely with the fellows. We sit literally about 15 feet away from each other, where their cubicles are directly outside my office. And with Richard, well, although they have standing time on his calendar to meet and receive executive mentoring and barrier removal and coaching, I help with more of the day-to-day functions of how do I get to this place, or who is this person, or politically, how do you think I should navigate this? And so we help establish those guardrails and keep people between them. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about are just 3 best practices. And before I go any further, I just want to say, I know best practice kind of stood out to me as a strange wording, because best is a superlative, and it just infers that there's some absolute to this. I think that these are practices that work really well for us. These aren't practices you'd go pick off the shelf at Ralph's or H-E-B and then plug them into your own organization. But for us at UCLA, they work really well, so I wanted to share them as things that might spark some more conversations. So the first practice that works really well for us is just our onboarding process. So the goal of our onboarding is to enable the incoming administrative fellow to acclimate and contribute as quickly as possible. And so for us, onboarding really begins in December before the fellow comes on. So we get our fellowship assignment in November or December, and within a couple of days of that, we actually connect the Army-Baylor fellow to our civilian fellow who's also coming on. So then they have one point of contact that they can talk to, that they can approach the fellowship together with. And then shortly thereafter, usually in December or January, we'll just put a 30-minute block of time on both fellows' calendars where they'll talk with each other, myself, and then the current fellows, just on a standing teleconference. And we make a point to say it's an unagendized telephone call, but we just want to put time on the calendar to talk, to start building the relationship, to talk about onboarding, to talk about any logistical things that may be standing between them and actually showing up in Southern California. In addition to that, we internally at UCLA Health develop a 60-day roadmap for them. So thinking about some of the shadowing experiences that we think that they should get, and thinking about the shadowing experiences that are laid out in the preceptor's manual, we go ahead and plug some of those things in for them. So on day 1, they've got a roadmap already started. At the same time as they're meeting with all of these senior leaders and people from middle management and people on the front lines during their 60-day onboarding process, we also encourage them, listen for projects, listen for those things that are high on the y-axis in organizational need and that might also interest you, and then go and actually see if there's an opportunity to start a project there as well. We also give them a fellow-driven onboarding document. We've had now a little over a decade's worth of civilian fellows at UCLA Health, and every single year the fellows add to an ongoing document of what's been helpful, what's been useful. We hand that over to them on day 1 so they can, again, know the guardrails and know what to expect. And then, again, we refine the onboarding process each and every year. So I had the performance evaluation just earlier this week with our civilian fellow, and we spent a good amount of time at the tail end of the evaluation just to say, what could we improve for next year, both from an onboarding process, but also the fellowship as a whole. And so this is something that we haven't yet stopped doing. The second thing that we do, and I think this works really well, is that we view both our Army-Baylor and our civilian fellows as co-equals in one and another of the same fellowship program. So here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see Richard and I, where we were celebrating 2 of our last fellows at a shared graduation. They both came out with a diploma from UCLA Health. We celebrated both of them at this external event. And then down below is when I was a fellow with my co-fellow, Major Dan Hefner, where we were doing a team building event. And I think that this is, the goal of doing this is that if you're just an average person within the UCLA health system, the 2 fellows are really indistinguishable from one another. They're part of a fellowship program. And I think this has been really helpful because whereas the Army-Baylor fellows come in with a world of experience and come in a little bit more professionally mature, having more applicable real-world experiences, our civilian fellows come in with just a different set of background and a different set of experiences. And so you can come together and complement each other's gaps really nicely. When I was a fellow myself, I said that having Major Dan Hefner as my co-fellow was the best unadvertised part of the fellowship program just for that reason. So I can speak to that personally as well. And the third practice that I think works really well for us is that we create an environment where leaders from all over the organization, there's a good push and pull with them for the administrative fellows. And I think this is really important because, again, you're coming out with all of this theoretical knowledge about leadership and what works well, to actually see people doing it and actually give you an example and a model for what that looks like on the real lines is really valuable. Again, the opportunity cost is also never lower as you go into your next role, whatever your next assignment is, or your full-time position, post-fellowship. You have accountabilities and you have responsibilities. And so this opportunity to go out and shadow and go to the incident review committee with a chief medical officer or go to a professional governance meeting with the chief nursing executive and just wander into their office and pick their brain. You don't get that opportunity in the next roles in your career. And so how do we do that? We start off again with our onboarding document and setting them up for success. And then we also talk to all of those people who we set them up with, and we talk about the value of mentoring, and we talk about what this means to them in their fellowship. So there's a symbiotic relationship. And finally, some of the past fellow projects that our both Army-Baylor and civilian fellows have worked on span from operations to strategy, finance, and then the people that we work with. We were fortunate to just go through a Joint Commission survey ourselves, and our administrative fellows were staffing the command centers and going out on tracers. We've done everything from writing business plans for our fellows to having them just be a fly on the wall in the health system budget meetings. It's a common refrain from Richard and myself that, oh, that could be a good fellow project. And then we just set them off to go. So that is the presentation. Are there any questions? Yeah?
Is UCLA in the HAMCAS system?
We are not in the HAMCAS system.
Okay, and for everyone in the room, the HAMCAS system for HAMI accredited programs, there's a lot of facilities that use HAMCAS, which is where all the residents across the country would put their name in, you know, and it's hospital-wide, and then they would go through like an interview process.
Mm-hmm.
And just our colleagues on a lot of the civilian institutions do actually do an interview process, which has been actually fairly beneficial to a lot of our students and our faculty, that we've kind of added that system in, and that's one of the things we appreciate from our civilian colleagues, is that just that interview process. And I've even seen some other organizations want to interview the students before they start, which I think could be a great idea as well, just to understand, you know, how that process works.
Yeah, although our civilian fellowship isn't a part of the standardized application process, there is an extremely rigorous selection process. And so to try and normalize that for the two fellows coming in, we do interview the Army-Baylor fellow so that when they come in and they sit next to the civilian fellow, they can both compare with each other. Oh yeah, we went through a similar but different process of getting into the organization.
Would you mind speaking to how you do that interview process for the process you went through? Or?
For the civilian fellows?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we're really fortunate to have a popular fellowship that folks across the country want to come to. And every year we'll get several hundred applications, not 700. We'll get several hundred applications for that 1 or 2 civilian slots. And what we do is we engage an entire executive selection committee to help comb through all of those resumes, take a look at every single one cover to cover and score it using a standard rubric, and then conduct the screening interviews using Skype. And then we invite a final swath of about a dozen or so candidates on site, put them through a whole day of interviews, a series of panels and one-on-ones. At the end of it, we come out with a single civilian fellow.
Our process is very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to highlight that for folks who don't do that. It's very rigorous for a lot of our colleagues, and it's a great opportunity for our students that I think is very important.
Mm.
Any questions? Well,
Okay, thank you.